te whatalo whatu, malo whalalo le whafunga le tunu, o le tatopo kalam whatulanga ina nei taltanoa e fo ima se tasi scientisti mai le Malaghan Institute of Medical Research. Ia o le tai au nei o le tato malo whalongia o Dr. Fran Priddy, o ia o le Clinical Director of Vaccine Alliance Aotearoa, New Zealand, o le Ohu Kaupare Huaketo. Ia mai taltanoa vo inisio ngā ruenga lo fia ngai maia. Whai vo inga nei lua o te lo taimila a tamu whaia o to atunu vaianga ia anto e whaalau lo atu inisio tato Paul Clam Mudi. Good morning, Talofa. Welcome to Samoa Capital Radio, Fran, Dr. Fran Priddy. Nice to have you on Samoa Capital Radio this morning.
Yora, thank you. It's very nice to be here.
Fran, before taking up the role of Executive Director of VAANZ Alliance Aotearoa, New Zealand, you were former Chief National Medical Officer and Vice President of Clinical Development at the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative in New York. What are some of the researches you were involved with that culminated in the development of vaccine or vaccines for infectious diseases?
Mm-hmm. Well, my prior role was to help run clinical studies and clinical trials of potential vaccines. So vaccine candidates against diseases like HIV and tuberculosis and other viral infections. But HIV and TB are two of the big ones where we don't have an effective licensed vaccine for adults yet.
Why is it so hard to get something sorted out for TB? It's been around now for more than 100 years, I understand.
Yeah, TB is really a very interesting disease, and it's been devastating, over the centuries. There's probably more written about TB, over the centuries than any other disease. Now that might change with COVID, but I think TB is still winning. It's a bacteria, but it's a tricky kind of bacteria that can become dormant kind of in your body, can be sleeping in your body. And that's why it's been so hard to wipe out with drugs or to prevent with the vaccine. And HIV is not a bacteria, it's a virus, viral disease, but also it's tricky. It doesn't have the long storied history of tuberculosis. HIV is a bit newer than TB in terms of human disease, but still it is proven to be extremely tricky, and it also can hide out in your cells, and that's why it causes these lifelong infections. So those are really some two very complicated diseases. In comparison, COVID is a bit more straightforward, actually.
Oh, that's good to hear. I thought we were going to have this long COVID. It'll be around for another century before you got a sort of a fix for it.
Well, it's possible that COVID will be here to stay, as they say, but it doesn't cause that chronic, except there are some. It doesn't tend to cause a chronic infection. Let's put it that way. And your immune system can respond to it and wipe it out for the most part. But it's tricky in that it can mutate, and we do see these variants now. But I don't think it's going to be as challenging as those two other diseases we talked about.
Right. TB, for some of our senior listeners, before we leave the island, we get tested or checked, and then they get treated for TB before we even leave the island. But it seems to have disappeared, for most of the Pacific Island nations, but it's still around in some countries. Like you said, it's still, around, and you're going to try and find a vaccine for it.
Yeah, no, it's a huge disease. It causes a lot of morbidity, disease in children and adults around the world. Sub-Saharan Africa, there's a quite heavy burden of TB. So yeah, actually economically, it's really an important disease to make a vaccine for, and there's a lot of groups and companies working on it, but we still don't have, a really highly effective one that's available for everyone to use.
Okay, just excuse me, I'm going to try and talk in the language here so our listeners will take them along with us. Fran, ole vainga le mo pentalta no mai scientist Fran Priddy. o ia o le director o le vaenga le ka o le Vaccine Alliance Aotearoa e umana fisiri le ipo le atono le vaenga le au le sa tal no inisi o su enga fa sa inisi na e mo hele TB ma le HIV ia o nisi ne fa ma i ngase telefo ina fi le la langi o le TB tele na mo ita tol Pacifica i o le buta o friend e o mo le temine e le i mo se vaccine mo le fa ma i le o se lau tau sanga o ngā lulu e scientist ai le mo wala se tui fo le fo e tong fi te tato ma o se tasi o vaenga o lu i tau o lo whenga i malato. Thank you, Fran. Perhaps tell our listeners, what is Vaccine Alliance Aotearoa New Zealand?
Yes. So Vaccine Alliance Aotearoa New Zealand, or Ohu Kaupare Huaketo, is a public-private research collaboration originally funded by the New Zealand government when COVID started as part of the COVID response. And the government decided to fund some research on vaccine development as a small part of the overall response. So what our groups are doing, there's multiple universities from New Zealand, like Otago, Victoria University at Wellington, and then other institutes like the Malaghan Institute, which does immunology research, and Crown Research Institute, so the government like ESR, and also private companies, such as our manufacturing partner. And all those groups are joined together now. All those groups have had experience in doing some parts of vaccine creation, but we haven't ever together in New Zealand developed a vaccine from scratch for humans. And so that's what this group was put together to do, that New Zealand realized, hey, we want to have these capabilities in the country. And so right now we're working with, from the lab to the manufacturing and then to get into clinical trials, 3 different possible COVID-19 candidates, vaccines. And hopefully one of those will, make it through to clinical studies and then could be something that we can license for use down the road in New Zealand and elsewhere.
So given that you've got this different universities and research institutes working on this, do you divvy up the work? Like, can you work on this part of the research and another university doing, or do you just let them loose and say, see if you can come up with a solution?
Yeah.
How do you?
So the last part, what you said, is exactly what we don't do. I mean, that's great. That's science.
Yes.
And that's great, and you need to have that science there, but the idea with product development or vaccine, any product development and vaccine or drug development is you need to go take that exciting creative science stuff, but then put it in a very structured pipeline of different steps. Right. And then you need to do it in a very rigorous way to make sure that you're getting a good product, that you have all the data that you need for the countries to approve your product, et cetera. And so each institute can add a different component of that. With one group, at Victoria University, for example, can design proteins in different formations to make a vaccine. Another group, another lab, say maybe at the same university, but another group can then test those different molecules to see, do they give an immune response? Another group, company, can do the manufacturing once you get ready, and put the product in vials. So each one can plays a different role. Okay.
So at this point in time, where are you at with this project?
Yeah. So we've been, together for over a year now. We're in our second year of this collaboration, and we have 3 potential really interesting COVID vaccines that would be considered next generation or second generation vaccines that could be used as a booster, because we see that we're probably going to need boosters in some format for the future. We're not sure how long we'll need them, and there's a large portion of the world that's not either vaccinated or boosted at all yet. And we also think that the vaccine field needs some vaccines that give you a more durable, more long-lasting immunity. And so that's something that we're working on. We have one vaccine that's about to enter in manufacturing, and we're getting ready to figure out how to make large amounts of it. So that's the one that's the farthest ahead, and the other two are still in the lab.
Right. Let me try and translate part of that for our listeners. Ole vaenga le matatano e le vaenga le ole olo taita ia e Fran. It's ole Vaccine Alliance Aotearoa New Zealand pole Ohu Kaupare Huaketo. Ole whalaputonga nei e ngā rue whaatasi ia ngā institution po university whaisusu ngā whaasai se ia Otago, Victoria University, ole Crown Entity ia le isa ESR, ia manisi o la tonga rue whaatasi na whaatupe le malo le amatanga ina wa amata le COVID. Asfuluiva. Ia matu ia le lui tau ia la tō ina ia tau whai e whai se tui pui mō tātou i New Zealand. E tu sala le whamtalanga Fran ia lepe ua tolu ni tui o lea ua wawa i ono ao ngā mō tātou i New Zealand. Ma o lea ua o elisi vaenga e whaataitai ma whai e suenga. Ia ma ia e tau ona pāsi e vaenga e se pāsi e ma whai ele na whai le tui. Ma le tūlanga nei o le wha moe o no o tu whai ngol tausanga nei o ma whai o na ngausia i te tonu New Zealand nei. Obviously with this type of project, there's a lot of checks and approval that you need, the ethics and things like that, Fran. We've got our own organization in New Zealand that look after that side of things. Is that right?
Yeah, and well, there's different types of approvals when you're doing research for vaccines. The main level of approval is really when you're starting to make plans to put your product, your candidate that's not approved yet, but to start testing it in humans. You know, those are the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials that we've been hearing about during COVID for the COVID vaccine. So that's really when you need to get ethical approval. And so New Zealand does have a national structure for reviewing interventional clinical trials in humans. Before you do the study, they have to approve it. And you submit quite a lot of information, the protocol, and a lot of background about the product you're thinking of testing. And then you also have to get review from your national regulators in New Zealand. That would be MedSafe if we were to do a phase 1 trial or any trial of a vaccine in New Zealand. So yeah, there's those two levels at a minimum. And so there's other approvals you might get from the institutions where you're trying to run the study. For example, if it's at a university, you also get community consultation. There's a Maori consultation process, and there's other, depending on what communities you're engaging in the research, you need to go to each of those communities and provide information before the study starts and get input on the study design and how to approach people to enroll, et cetera. So there's quite a lot of different steps you would go through before you start the trial.
For a lay person, obviously, you've got several scientists who are looking at particular areas of research. With your previous experience in the HIV and TB, what are some of the challenges or the things that frustrated the scientists when they're doing research?
You mean for COVID or just in general?
COVID, or general.
Well, I mean, I think in the past, one of the main frustrations was it takes a long time to get an exciting idea from a scientist in the lab. It takes a long time to get it to be a product that can help someone or that can prevent a disease. So I think the timeline for drug and vaccine development is really frustrating. But it's there for a reason. It's there so that all of those steps, I just mentioned some of the steps, but so all those steps can be done in a really careful way by highly qualified people before you put people at risk from a new product or new vaccine. And particularly for vaccines, safety is so important because you're trying to prevent disease in someone otherwise healthy generally. You know, they don't
Yes.
have COVID. You're trying to prevent it. So you don't want to give them a vaccine that could cause any health problems at all. Whereas when you're treating a disease, people are willing to accept some level maybe of side effects from medications because they really want, you know, they need to have their disease treated, cured, or managed. So there's a higher safety bar for vaccines. So I think the timeline is one frustration. And I think the other frustration is, well, the science itself is really challenging for these viral diseases. I already mentioned TB, which is a bacteria, HIV. And even though COVID's not as tricky, we can see it still has its challenges. So I think the science is another. It's exciting, but it can also be quite frustrating. So those are two areas.
Right. I think the world has been very lucky that we managed to get a vaccine for COVID-19, given if it's taking so long to develop these vaccines. And the turnaround for this COVID was in, what, 2 years, 3 years?
Oh, yeah, a year. I mean, it was, so that's been a great breakthrough to see how quickly it was developed, the COVID vaccines. So first of all, how, you know, that happened because there was the will internationally and by some governments, and with the need to get a vaccine was so high, you know, economically and socially and people's health. And there was the government will to work together and to allow, not to bend the norms, but to go faster.
Yes.
To make sure we still got all the safety we needed, but to go faster. And there was also a lot of money together with that political will. So that's what made it possible. And then also the science that has been building up over the past 20 years in vaccinology, working on all these difficult diseases. Actually, all of that learning was applied directly in the COVID race to a vaccine. Almost everything that has been learned trying to get an HIV or TB or a Zika vaccine or all these other diseases that have come up, even our common, our established vaccines over the past 20 years, we've learned how to make them better. You know, we're trying to make flu better. All of that learning helped us jumpstart to get the COVID vaccine so quickly. And then in addition, we were, I wouldn't say lucky, but in some ways fortunate that COVID, that the virus itself, SARS-CoV-2, it's actually fairly easy to neutralize it, to block infection with the vaccine, at least initially for several months. You know, then we have the problem that the virus changes and we need to change the vaccine or revaccinate. But initially, it's pretty easy to have a highly effective vaccine against COVID. So that's good.
Right. Do you think it's likely that it can be wiped? This COVID?
You mean eradicated from the planet?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I think eradication is likely impossible because mainly because this virus can infect animals. And whenever you have an animal called reservoir for a virus, and it can affect multiple species of animals, COVID can. So that means that it will be impossible to wipe out, you know, there's too much transmission that could be going on in different species. If it was just confined to humans and it could not infect that is possible we could eradicate it, but we've eradicated only one, you know, only smallpox has been eradicated from humans.
Right, so it'll be another addition to the suite of flus that we currently live with.
Yeah, I think that COVID is evolving as we speak. We're seeing the virus change over time, and over time it might settle into some pattern of being a more minor respiratory infection. I hope it will become even more minor than flu, perhaps. And flu's not minor, flu's important, but hopefully it will become less pathogenic or less deadly than flu over time. We're really at the very early stage of this human viral relationship. You know, like other viruses like flu have been around for hundreds of years. Even HIV, which has been in the human population for less than 50 years, you know, we know a lot more about how HIV responds to when it infects humans and how HIV changes. We've only in the first couple of years with COVID, so we have a long way to go. I think it will change a lot over time, and likely it will reduce in severity, and the challenges we're having likely will go down over time, because viruses tend to evolve to be more steady state. That tends to be how they operate.
So is your team of scientists anticipating or expecting another variant? We've had Delta, we've got Omicron.
Yes, we have a second Omicron that you may have heard about in the news recently with the
BA.
The Omicron Delta mixture.
Right. Yes.
So there will be other mutations that arise, but it appears unlikely that there'll be a mutation that will then become much more serious. It seems that as we go through the mutations, we're seeing a little bit less severity of disease, as we go through. So I hope that trend will continue. The big question is really, will the vaccines that we have now that were based on the original, we call the Wuhan strain, the original SARS-CoV-2, does the immunity that we've all gotten, those of us who've been vaccinated or had COVID, but particularly those of us who've been vaccinated with the current vaccines, how long will that last? And will it last against different variants? Because actually the current vaccines of Pfizer that we're using in New Zealand, it does give pretty good protection against Omicron disease, like keeping you out of the hospital if you have Omicron. It's not as good as it was against the original strain, but it does still offer some protection. So will that be true for the next variant? That's the question.
All right. Thank you. Let me try and say that in Samoan.
Okay.
Ole tele yo pai ngai matata no fa malu tele tunu ono le tam fai e mo umole ava no fa tata no le ngan fa peritania. Ale la tam fai o twani si vai ngai molta to fa fongol temini. Ai o por kala me ni si temi fa li wa to ai no to e va to le e mo si le fiel tato tunu. Ole vai ngan tata no ye po ani vai nga e tula i mai fa fita uri ponu tau mo le au fa scientist e fa ia mo me so enga e wo vai nga na sa o le timeline ia ma le science tu so vai nga ia o le fa nga fa tau u si so enga e u mia ona fa so enga e pe ona ia ta o le TP e o mai nei e le mo la va se tui o le TP a u si vai nga ia fa ia e o le HIV na ia ta o la lo mo le dimas full tau sanga a o si fo ia vai nga ia fa so enga o le lopo le atomo le temi e maua se tali o su ngai fai. O le tūlanga la le COVID, e lea o le lucky po le whamai o le lucky o le fortunate, o le tāua le vaenga lea, o le iai o su enga o mana fai mua i le tūlanga o le coronavirus. Na fai ngofia ai o na maua le tali mo le su enga o se vai o le tui mo tātou. Ia na i tāua fo i sa iai uma loto tasi umoi no o laulangi e whaatupe ma whaisu suenga ina ia wawe se mau se tali mo laulangi ina ua vai atu o pe pesi tele wha mai ma mani di waitangata. Ia antono o ngana o mau scientisi o la tau le tu iai su e mai po le ase fō le mai lea. Ia o le ala iai tātou le teimi nei. O le laki la na o le tūlanga pe ona iai tā ua. O le coronavirus e iai le abanoa e mawhai ei o na tong fitia le i tusu enga lo whai ni New Zealand. Ia atono vaenga nei vai fo i tātou ma tātou muri whamtaranga pe o i tātou por kalame nei ina ia tātou mo le la fo i le i ngā ruenga scientisi ma tamu whainga la tō. Fran, I understand VAANZ is undertaking or was undertaking a clinical study on immune responses to the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. Please tell our listeners about the study.
Yeah, so the study we're conducting right now is called the Ohu Kaupare study, which means from knowledge comes well-being. And it's a study of about 300 New Zealanders to see are the immune responses after getting vaccinated with the Pfizer COVID vaccine, are they as expected? Because that vaccine, none of the trials for any of the COVID vaccines initially were done in New Zealand, and there were very few Pacific peoples included in all those large trials because they were done, generally outside the Pacific. So in New Zealand, we wanted to know for Maori and Pacifica, as well as elderly in general, what are the immune responses like to the Pfizer vaccine? So we worked with 2 clinical sites, one in Rotorua, one in Christchurch, and they helped us enroll about 300 adults or people of 16 and older into the study. Those people were getting the vaccine already through the government vaccination program. And then we collected blood samples before and after the vaccination. We'll also be collecting blood samples before and after their booster. Most of these people plan to get a booster, a 3rd dose as well. So what we're looking at in the study is, what is your antibody response level? And we're looking to see, is it what's similar to what was seen in the larger trials? Are there any differences by age? Are there differences by ethnicity? And also looking at things like body weight. And we have people enrolled that have quite a pretty high rate of other diseases like heart disease, lung disease, diabetes. And we enrolled those people purposely because those are the people most at risk to be sick with COVID and get hospitalized. So we wanted to make sure they were really well represented in the study. And I think we have about 80 Pacifica participants in the study, which is a really good chunk of people. So we'll have that data available in the next couple of weeks. I don't have the details, but in general, it looks very good. I think that people are going to feel really confident when they see this data that New Zealanders, have a good response to the vaccine. So we're really happy about that.
Well, this outcome of this research can be translated to compared to another vaccine.
Well, everyone here received the Pfizer vaccine because of the way the people in the study, almost everyone in New Zealand at that time, last year when we started the study, was getting the Pfizer vaccine. So the best comparison is probably to compare the people in New Zealand, their response to the Pfizer vaccine, to people in other parts of the world who got the Pfizer vaccine. Right. And do we have a similar level? And in particular, you want to see other subgroups that have a lower level. They might still be protected, but they need to be followed carefully because if you start off with a somewhat lower level, your protection might drop down quicker than the other groups. So, and that's what's been seen internationally, for example, with older adults, over 65, over 75, their antibody levels, which is the antibody level with the COVID vaccine is what indicates that you're going to be protected, initially at least. So when the antibody level drops really quickly, that's a concern. And so you want to follow those groups that might start off with a somewhat lower level. And those are the groups that you probably would want to offer a booster for. And that's basically exactly what's happened in New Zealand, where a booster was offered to everyone, but now there's some discussion, about do we need a second booster, a 4th dose, and should that be provided to everyone, or should it just be to the groups that we know are going to have a fall off in their antibody level, primarily because of their age, or also people who have immunocompromising medical conditions, often start off with a lower antibody level after getting vaccinated.
Yeah. So when you say lower level, you talk about antibodies.
Yeah, an antibody level in response to the vaccine.
So you almost need to have a test to find out your antibody level before you decide whether you need a booster vaccine or not.
Well, no, I wouldn't recommend that it be done on an individual level.
Okay.
So I think that it's important that we have studies like the one we're conducting, and you can look, there's a lot of international information on this too. It's better to have a large kind of population study.
Yes.
And so you can say, in general, people have about an average of this amount of antibody. Because I think on an individual level, we don't do that for most other vaccines, except in very unique cases like certain healthcare workers. We might test their vaccine response. And then again, certain people with immunocompromised conditions at certain points in their treatment, we might check to see what their vaccine response is. But otherwise, it's much better to have a general information, and not the individual level is too much for people to manage. Imagine everyone in the world had to check their vaccine antibody level. It's just too much for any health system to deal with.
Yeah. I know for Pacifica, sometimes we say, don't put us all together because we're different. Samoans are different from Tongans. The Tongans are different from Tuvaluans and Tokelauans. So is there an idea of going to that type of ethnicity?
Well, part of the study was to look at the unique kind of ethnic groups that are in New Zealand because they weren't included in the other research. So we have about a third of the participants are Maori, about a third are Pacifica. Yeah. Within that, it's primarily Samoan. I think there's 80 Pacifica participants and there's 45 Samoan. Okay. So that's a really heavy representation. And then there's smaller numbers of other groups like Tongan, Tokelauan, Fijian. So it probably is not large enough for each individual Pacific Island group to be evaluated separately. But I think that when you see the data, you'll see that there's so much similarity among all the ethnic groups that it definitely supports what's generally felt in the vaccinology field, that ethnicity is not likely to be a predictor of different responses to vaccines. Okay. Things like age and having other diseases, those are more likely. That's kind of what we feel the vaccine field. We didn't know how it would play out for COVID vaccines. Yeah. But I think you'll see the results of this study are going to confirm what we thought, that ethnicity is probably not a factor. Yeah. And your ethnicity, you'll still get a response to the vaccine.
We all adopted a similar lifestyle when we came out to New Zealand. So we eat all this fast food and all. So we tend to get the same sort of diseases.
Yeah, I think the lifestyle and the other health factors are more could play more of a role than. And that's what our studies, what we're seeing so far, that the lifestyle and other factors is more important, and really medical conditions are more important, and age. So more important than ethnicity in terms of this particular, question.
Thank you, Fran. I'll just try and say that some in Samoan and then come back to you. Ole paanga tēnea mai ngene mataltana noa nei I le vava ai o tātou a pe ususu inga lena whai kalaistete ma tokoroa. E whaatatau lea I tātou tangata Pasifika ma Māori ma le awhianga I tuia mo le COVID. O lea lai whiwhia fo e valsfulu pe ama le valsfulu tangata Pasifika na ia a pe whasu limo tangata Samoa. Ia o le whaisusu inga e vava ai lato I le tūlanga le matua o tangata. Wa nisi ngase tu mau o iai. Ma le awhianga pe a whaile tui leo o le tui o le COVID pe o na tātou iai. Ia o vaenga o mala lai whaile la tususu inga o lele I mautu ia mo me o tāta po wha mo maunga ia. A iesi taimi I ona whailola ia po atunua le awhianga. A pei o vaenga ia ta mo se mama maanga. Le awhianga o tātou tangata Pasifika I le tui ia wa o lewa na whai I nuu mamau, nuu I Europa. Ia to te le pālangi taitusa o malatou. A le wa whaisisa I ringa le awhianga mo le ngata ia tātou Pasifika e whapena Māori. Ia le ala watu mo fisi. Telo taimi tu whaatasi umata tātou Pasifika. Ia ese Samoa, ese isi moto Pasifika. Tonga ma. Ia ai pewa aila tō e taitu sa tātou taimine I tūranga. E leo whaapeo o le tangata anu. Ai pe o le soifuanga o tangata Pasifika. Ia awa fo ia tātou mai nei le usuita o mawha leo tātou aiai. Ia o mau whaatasi e tātou I to inga mai nu leo tātou iai. E pe unisina vaenga o le whatatai noe I su engare iei nei le study le na whai e lātou. Fran, how do you see the future vaccine develop in New Zealand? I think having this VAANZ, the alliance, it's a step forward to produce, working together, collaborating and coming out of treatment for other vaccines or, disease in this part of the world.
Exactly. The goal of VAANZ is to have the capabilities in place and kind of working together. And so, I don't think that VAANZ is going to be making all the vaccines for New Zealand, in the future. No, New Zealand will still purchase vaccines that are used internationally, et cetera. But there definitely is a need in New Zealand and then in the region when there are regional issues that New Zealand would be able to respond to. So if there's a particular outbreak of something that the rest of the world is really not that interested in or not that affected by, you would have the capacity here, particularly because VAANZ is working on putting some mRNA vaccine capabilities in place in New Zealand. So, and learning how to make mRNA vaccines and getting all the pieces, the science and all of the rights to use different molecules, et cetera, to make mRNA vaccines so that in the future, when there are diseases, and there are actually some now that we're talking about, both veterinary vaccines and humans, we could start thinking about, why don't we learn how to make this here in New Zealand and get it licensed to be used in New Zealand and in the region. It could also perhaps be a product for other parts of the world too, but right now we're just thinking about New Zealand and the Pacific region.
And I think it'll also help us with the cost, the economy of purchasing these. Lately we've had news from around the Pacific region and even here, some of the vaccines they purchased, they expired or running out of the useful life, shelf life. So that's,
you have more control over the access to the vaccines and the amount that you need if you can manufacture. And the mRNA, the new mRNA technology makes it a lot easier for to do smaller scale production of vaccines. It's more feasible.
Right. Fran, how would you compare the way New Zealand has handled COVID-19 when you look at what happened around the world?
Oh, yeah, that's a long story, isn't it? There's a lot of ways to look at it. I mean, there's the whole COVID pandemic, the outbreak here and how that was managed. But in terms of vaccine response, I think New Zealand, there've been some gaps for sure. And I think, those need to be addressed. But I think in general, New Zealand, took a cautious approach. They didn't rush out and get the very first vaccine that was available. They were cautious. They went with well-known vaccine makers. They made these advanced purchase agreements for multiple vaccines. So they were hedging their bets.
Right.
They weren't beholden to one particular country or another, like that it had to be a UK or a Chinese or US, but they went with very high quality companies that have track records generally in vaccines. So I think that New Zealand wound up with a very high quality program in terms of the vaccines that were available. And they weren't rushed. New Zealand was lucky it had some time because of the borders. I know, though, that I think people were a little perplexed about, it was clear that there were some populations who were going to be at higher risk for COVID disease. And that was borne out once we did have widespread COVID, that, elderly people in care homes, Maori and Pacific people had higher rates of hospitalization. And, I think the rollout, looking back, the rollout could have been focusing on those populations sooner. I think the rollout did focus on those populations, but it took time. And I think because the elderly above 65, that doesn't include a lot of the Maori and Pacifica that are older adults in those populations. They may not be above 65, but they're older and they have comorbid they have other diseases like heart disease or pulmonary diabetes, etc. So I think that that could have been approached better. But I'd have to give it like an A. Overall, I would give it an A. There's these gaps, but compared to the rest of the world, there's no doubt this has been a much better pathway here. There is no doubt.
Yeah, at the start in 2020, when we look at what was happening in the hospitals in Italy and those countries in Europe, and in the hospitals were full of the sick, and I think we did reasonably well.
Yeah, I think in terms of controlling the disease, the spread in the disease, that's like an A+ for New Zealand. Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be problems in a free society like this. There's always going to be gaps, and you can't solve every problem. But I mean, the number of it's very unfortunate now to see, the daily death numbers are going up or are higher than we've ever seen here. But in comparison to other countries, this has saved so many people. New Zealand's response, despite all the months of closed borders and the economic, agonies and stuff, it's saved so many lives here.
Yes, I think that's a hard act for government to follow, trying to balance the economic needs of the business sector and then the health of the community, in the country. And now we've opened up some of the restrictions, and now we find the rates go up in terms of deaths and people hospitalized.
Yeah, but overall, I would say they have had a pretty cautious approach here, and I think it's definitely saved lives.
All right, thank you. Last question. Sorry, we've had all this time talking and trying to fill in the Samoan for the language. Some people would be sick from the Omicron, but have not been vaccinated. What would be your advice for them?
Yeah, the advice is still that you should and can still get vaccinated, but the advice remains for now to wait 3 months till after you have recovered from your COVID infection. So if you have a confirmed COVID infection, it really should be confirmed with a test. Then you're supposed to wait 3 months before getting vaccinated, and there will still be vaccines available then. And you probably you do have some protection after having had COVID. For a period of several months, you have some level of protection. It's not perfect, so it's okay to wait that time. And I think the idea also is your immune system will have an even better response to the vaccine if you give it time to recover from COVID, and 3 months later to be exposed again to a part of the COVID through the vaccine will give you a really good immune response. It probably will last longer than if you try to get vaccinated right after having COVID. It's better to have some space in there.
All right. So VAANZ will have present New Zealand with a Christmas present end of this year with a booster vaccine.
we won't have a vaccine that's ready for people to take, but we will have a vaccine that'll be ready to go into a clinical trial for next year. So that's our New Year's present. To New Zealand is that you'll have a homegrown, New Zealand-made vaccine that's could be a booster, but we'll be testing it in the clinical trials. And
we can share that with our Pacific nations.
Yeah, we could if we're able to take it all the way through and get it licensed. Then yes, we would be able to share it.
Hi, thank you very much, Fran, for your time this morning. It's good to having you and to share this to inform our community about what's happening in the world of science.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I had a wonderful time talking with you.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Bye for now. Bye. Yeah, now whātofa tato malo whaonongi o tai au nei o le scientist of Dr. Fran Priddy o ia o le ta ia le vaenga le o tu whasia i ngā lui whaatasi i scientist su i nei New Zealand. E le Malaghan Institute of Medical Research o le Otago University o Wellington o Kilani. Ia manisi o Crown Entity se whamaia ESR. O le lato ngā luenga na amata loa pēr na mō matatu tanoanga. Na amata loa le amatanga o wa awhia la rangi le COVID. Ngā lua lo le malo New Zealand. ma fa vai le vai ngalia ma ave ele la le fo le la tu tau ina ia faia se tui mo tatou wal te media wa o manu o le la langi ma la to sainisi ma tamu fai e fai pe se tui e fo ia ile Italia to le covid na wa fie tatou ile la langi ia le la ele vai ngalia o ia la te ia vai ngalia ngalu fatasi e ma le pe o fai lo mai o le au amata o no o le tūlanga o papala mai e pēa ma le tolu i e tua inga tui o le ua mawhai o na baba ai e tue o no wha o le teimi e fo i e pāsia o mai o na vaenga ese ese ia o na tamwhaile i e a fo i e whausia mo tātou i e te tono mo le tolu le o la asu e apo whele tui pito sirina le dei le tau le booster vaccine ia na mai lole e whai i mo tātou Io le nafsini mulmuli nei, pe o se mea lofa tā wala le mo kisimasi mo tātou i New Zealand fa mai le lopo le tausanga fōu. A le au ngā luenga o le tamu whai ina ia mau se ato le vaenga le ia pāsia pe au atu whai mo le tausanga nei. O le au ngā o le o suenga le whai. O le whai ma ua iei ma suenga le pe o na maua mai fo inisi o vaenga o le interview. O le na whai le research po suenga o tangata Pasifika ma Maori. Ma le afianga o lātou i le tui o le COVID. E sa whai e kalaistete lesi. Ia ma tamu whai ina ia vaipo le asisi vaenga te tau o na suia i mo le whainga o le booster vaccine le tamu whai po le tui lea. Whapopo. Ina ia tadia le lei ma fo i talwhenga i tonu a mo tātou tangata Pasifika Māori. Ia lena ia tā o whaulawe oisi million tu ia na le tui o tātou. Ai le o mawhai o na wa ai tonu a po ani ngase tu maulo i el tangata o isi e tele fo ia latu rango latu so i fua malolo i ne fia mo ese si so soani ina ia talawhia ngai tonu a male tui ai pe o le vaenga na le whaanganga latu ia ina ia wawa ai o naifsiri mulibuli e lua lele i o i le vaenga i le lana ia le wa ai i le ngai oinga na whaia New Zealand ina ua pisia le laulangi le whaamai. Ia lai whamailan tala na te o lana ia wa ai o le ei le maka na te vea New Zealand. Ona o le lei o le tauwhi whinga o le tātou tua oi. Le ana na tua ei o na tele le pisi o le whaamai ni New Zealand ma mani liwa tangata. Ia tono nai muli ma umai tātou le vaenga na. Ai a ofo le si tūlanga lana ia wa ai mali whaanga yoingo i si la tō tonu whai ia maua na tau le A+ e si le tūlunga le ei. Ila na ia na vai ai ei fo te tonu o fai ungal malo ni sio vaenga la na ia vai a tonu e tauna to e vai ai le fa nga so longa le o tui le ma wena tangata Maori mani sio Pacific a misa Maori le toi ona tui tangata pe o le fo i fai tio nei Maori ia tonu o vaenga umana o le fo i vai de malo po le se au wala vai mo le lumana a vai le pa woi so inga fa mai mo ta tonu e fo te me to mo i si vaenga ia ai ambaia le sona ia wa i malena Facebook suenga nei ia foto ina fo ima taita ili mai nei le atunu male malo i le me te tau na fai o le me le o va e to le me fo ina na fai interview nei o le le tino le butu fata se le malo o sai nisi o mata to New Zealand o le Facebook suenga mai university o le Malaghan e pe na ia ma le o fa vai le tino le tasi enga le fata si me fa pene ma fai e tui le foi mo le saunoanga friend e le na tātou lai ne o ngā lue vaenga ia o lo e fo le pitanga mai si so e Amerika mai si no laulang awala foi fai la to so e ngai tasi so e ngole tui mo fa mai ia ona fo le fetu fai la ia le to mai foi mal lama ina ia fai mo fiena mo se tui poston fiti le mo masenga se ele ngata New Zealand ale laulang ia toa o mela na le mane fo le tanoanga ta fa mamlam mai vaenga ne ia malvaenga muli mo o to ia le o mo le ngase o le Omicron po le Delta pe na mo fo le COVID ia le fa mai ai malusi ia le ia le taimi le tu mai tau e ona e fatali to fa ile so tui mo le fotuanga e te tau ana e re failu tui ina ia pui ato to oi ato no ia inisi o tato tau ainga po nisi fo iwa badi diu po mo mele vala au pe ia le tua ia o isi e dana i fo isi mai ngase tu mau ia ai falo leve o le termine ia o la fo wa fie ile ale le Omicron po le virusi dia ia o la e fa pe ia o le fa mai le wala ina maliu ia o isi le ai o tūlanga o iei le smatua o soifua o tangata ma le a fo i nisi fo i utunga o mai tūmau. Ia o vaenga nei wa iei. Ai mo tātou ai e te lo tātou pukala e me o le soifua maloloina. Ia le fautua le tūlanga o le tau mawhapaleni. Fai le exercise o le fo i mau e mtanoanga ma Dr. Semisi ai ono. Fautua ina tātou ia tu ule ulula. Ia o le inu ava malosi. Ia o me umane i pe fo ina tatano tol pokala. A fai a fuafua le le a uso ona faia. Ia atonu ai le a fai. Ia wha lawe o tātou te le alfa o ngā isi vaenga ia. Ai mai se ala tūlanga ia fautua ina mai tātou ina ia tātou pe o le ulula te paa po sikaliti. Ia e whainga tātele nei tātou tangata ia o māsani ei. Ia ai pe o fautua ngana mai ai i fō mai. O la tau le whiangai tōnu a male. Ma inga fo i o le soifua lei o tangata i ia tunu nei ia mai se fo i ni sino. O vaenga tau ona tātou muni ta i ai. A le Porkalamina tātou mwhaintu whaatsia ni tāi au tala noa i vaenga lea. Ia, tau whaamamlama mai vaenga o lo whainga luenga mene o scientist. Ia o lo ngā lua i fo tātou ofisa nei ma le Malaghan Institute of Research, Medical Research. E le professor ia Graham Lacrosse. Ia ma le lato comms manager ia Gail. Ia la wana le te dana whiutanga i ma whaatulanga mai tātou Porkalame. O le masina fau ia aperila. O le la talatala noa i le mata upune o le immune system. Le to te mauma ia. A le le vaenga na o lo tino. A tonu e te le ngase ngofie pe po ia ngofie o se mai. A wai o vaenga na te ea tui mai ia pe a ngofie tātou i siama o virusi. Ia o le mea le fie mamla mai tātou e whaafea o na whaale leia le immune system tangata. O a me tauna whaale tangata ina ia lava pui e la tāpena tātou i pui pe te ea te fo i wha mai. A wā a le lei ato tō le vaenga lea. Ia o na le lei fo i leo tātou soi fua maloloina. Ia a whaapea lena tā ua e preferen low level of antibodies tōno tangata. Ia e na whai tauna whai se ngā luenga. Ia tau sia o Porkalame an mua la manmala mati le tātou. Ia fautua ina i fo ima tai ni mai nei tātou me tauna whai a wāla walwa i o soi fua lau le lei o tātou tangata Samoa. Ia ma tātou Pasifika. Mo whafonga le tū, whautai whafonga mai, mo se sia manota tanoa fo se Porkalame whapenan masina fo. Ia le te minei, ia tō wha soi fua.